They tossed you aside like it was nothing. Strange, isn't it, how a single careless gesture can hit harder than 1,000 words? How someone can drop you as if you were weightless, while you were carrying the whole connection on your shoulders. For a moment it stuns you. For a moment it hurts in places even your memories don't reach. And for a moment you think this is the end of your story. But it isn't, because what looks like the moment you break is often the moment you begin. There is a silence that arrives only after you've been dismissed. Not the silence of defeat, not the silence of someone who has nothing left to say. It's a different kind of silence, a silence that rearranges your entire inner world. Without making any sound at first, you feel the emptiness they left behind, and slowly, you begin to notice something else growing inside. Clarity, strength, self-respect, quiet realization that someone tossing you aside doesn't define your worth, it exposes theirs. Because here's the truth, people rarely admit they didn't throw you away because you were insignificant. They threw you away because your presence highlighted everything. They didn't want to confront your depth, your sincerity, your emotional courage, your refusal to play games. And fragile people don't know what to do with someone real, so they push you out, they look elsewhere, they disappear. They pretend you were too much when in reality you were simply more than their ego could handle. And while they tell themselves this is freedom, you step into a silence that changes everything. Your silence is not surrender, your silence is recalibration. Your silence is the moment you withdraw your energy from someone who never knew how to protect it. And here's where the story flips. The very silence they thought would break you, and it begins to break their ego, because silence removes their audience, silence removes their control, silence removes their ability to measure their worth through your reactions. Silence forces them to face the truth without the distraction of your presence. And while you grow steady, they grow uneasy. They start checking, wondering, replaying, questioning. Because suddenly the person they expected to crumble is standing taller than ever, and doing it without them. That's when their ego begins to tremble. Not when you cried, not when you explained, not when you tried to fix things, but when you finally stopped, when you chose calm over chaos, silence over chasing, self-respect over emotional survival. That's the moment everything they built on your reactions begins to collapse. Because fragile egos don't fear losing you. They fear losing access to you. They fear losing the emotional influence they used to have over you. They fear realizing you're not waiting for them anymore. Your silence tells them exactly that, and it terrifies them. They start wondering why you're calm, why you're distant, you're no longer available to be their emotional cushion, why the person who once tried so hard no longer tries at all. And slowly, painfully, they begin to understand you're not silent because you're broken. You're silent because you've outgrown the need to be understood by someone who never listened. You're not distant because you're hurt. You're distant because you're healing in ways they can't follow. You're not cold, you're done. Your silence becomes the moment their ego collapses under the weight of its own illusions. And while they feel the consequences of their choice, you step into a new version of yourself, one that no longer chases, explains, or negotiates for emotional scraps. They tossed you aside like it was nothing good. Because now through your silence, they are about to learn exactly what nothing truly loses. Before we continue deeper into this journey, if this message brings you strength, clarity, or the calm you've been searching for, consider supporting this Stoic movement by clicking the super thanks button and donating any amount. It helps keep this channel alive and allows these teachings to reach even more people who need them as much as you once did. Now take a breath, let's go further. There comes a point where things stop looking like a string of unlucky moments and start revealing themselves for what they were all along. It's almost imperceptible. At first, a quiet shift that runs through your chest like a cold current. And in that thin crack of awareness, you finally understand they never truly saw you, not once. And the sound of that realization hits harder than any argument ever could. You recognize it in hindsight. It wasn't distraction. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't one of those rough phases you clung to just to keep your world from collapsing. It was a decision, slow, deliberate, disguised as normality. As in that decision placed you on the outskirts of their life without even the courtesy of a reason. Truth lands at night when your phone stays still and the room feels wider than usual, not because you're lonely, but because you can suddenly see the open, echoing space left by someone who never learned how to stay. And so you start piecing things together. You replay moments you brushed aside. You revisit silences you convinced yourself were harmless. You think about the distance You rebranded as emotional maturity. Every answer feels like a blade turning, pressing into the wound you tried to pretend wasn't there. The truth is simple and merciless. The person who threw you away didn't do it all at once. It came through small dismissals, tiny fractures, offhand comments that meant nothing to them but left you drained for hours. You notice every detail only when it's too late. When the patterns finally line up in front of you, coldness disguised as independence, hesitant, dressed up as freedom, quiet labeled as peace. It was all a performance scene. You were the only one applauding, and as you follow the breadcrumbs back to their source, your mind whispers a sentence you hate but can no longer avoid. This was never love, never create. Was a psychological dance in which you played the anchor and they played the escape artist who ran every time authenticity got too close. This is where the illusion shatters, not because they left, but because you stopped chasing. You finally realized you didn't lose someone, you simply stopped pursuing a person incapable of presencing. That clarity arrives sharp and clean, almost surgical. The first fracture occurs when you understand that affection isn't enough, that giving everything doesn't magically fix what was uneven from the start, that an imbalanced connection cannot be repaired by pouring more of yourself into it. Truth isn't bitter. The truth frees you. Then comes the second fracture, your silence, not their sires. The silence born from no longer explaining yourself, no longer cushioning their behavior, no longer manufacturing excuses for someone who treated you like a placeholder. Your silence rearranges the whole dynamic. It breaks the script. It pulls the spotlight away from the manipulator, and without an audience, their ego begins to shake. That's the moment the game collapses and reality steps out of the shadows. But the deepest fracture grows from one unavoidable realization: if they discarded you so effortless, light means you were offering far more than they were capable of returning. And instead of destroying you, that truth rebuilds you. When the mask finally falls, everything becomes clear. You weren't hard to love. You were hard to control. That's why they called their exit freedom. It wasn't freedom, it was avoidance dressed in poetic language. Illusions don't break with fireworks, they break in a quiet breath. In the moment you admit a sentence you resisted for too long: they never deserved the place you gave them. And as those words settle inside you, something realigns. No more fantasies, no more emotional theater, only truth unpolished and finally yours. Is it painful? Is it necessary? Always, because illusion binds you, truth releases you, and once truth arrives, the game flips forever. This time in your favor. There's another truth no one mentions in the beginning: people who push you away aren't choosing independence. They're choosing self-preservation, not from you but from the reflection of themselves that your presence triggered. You were the mirror they couldn't stand to face. Every time you came close, something in them trembled, not out of irritation, out of fear of being seen. Without their mask, without their carefully constructed roles, without the emotional armor that kept their fragile sense of power intact, they treated you as replaceable, not because you lacked value, but because your value exposed them. The ego, when threatened with collapse, accuses to exile those who see too much. Avoidant people don't run from others, they run from the cavern inside themselves, from the noise. Your quiet understanding stirred in them from the intensity. They were never taught to navigate. The distance they handed you wasn't a boundary, it was a shield, a survival tactic, a way to avoid confronting the truth of what they felt, to avoid admitting that for them love always arrives with too many internal earthquakes. More clarity you sought, the more escape routes they searched for, the more emotional maturity you offer at, the more they retreated into their cold and self-sufficient persona, not out of cruelty, but incapacity. They could not inhabit the same emotional depth you lived in. Their manipulation wasn't sophisticated. It was subtle, strategically timed silences, inconsistent attention, ambiguous words that left you suspended, a psychological dance designed to maintain a superiority that never existed. A fragile ego doesn't build, it manages, it controls. It pushes away, it tests, it feels powerful only when you're busy trying to decode what you did wrong. That was the rhythm. You brought depth, they brought confusion, and confusion was their safe house. Chaos was their comfort zone because it required no accountability, no growth, no vulnerability. That is why they discarded you like it meant nothing, not because they didn't feel, but because they felt too much and didn't know what to do with it. Emotional detachment was their crutch, not their strength. Understanding this hurts, but it's the only way to stop making their wound your identity. Their exit wasn't a verdict on your worth, it was a verdict on their limited capacity for intimacy. The dynamic was always the same. You sought connection, They sought protection, you offered truth. They offered distance, moved forward, they stepped back, a painful choreography. That could never last, and now that you finally see the full picture, you can make the one movement that ends the cycle forever. Understand that their behavior spoke only about them, not about you. There is a moment that arrives without sound, a moment no one witnesses, a moment when something in you stops begging for explanations and starts demanding truth, and that is where your decision is born. It isn't anger, it isn't revenge. It's clarity, a kind of clarity that settles into your bones when you finally realize that insisting, hoping, pushing, explaining one more time is just a quiet way of abandoning yourself. And you're done doing that. You are done choosing others over your own oxygen. You begin to see that you can't keep breathing life into a story where you're the only one fighting to keep it alive, and that realization doesn't burst out as a scream. It comes as a long exhale, the kind you release when you accept that your heart deserves a space where it doesn't have to beg for room. This decision doesn't rise from pride, it rises from emotional exhaustion. Because every time you tried to fix the situation, they just drifted further away, and slowly, piece by piece, you understood this wasn't a puzzle to solve. It was a truth to recognize. That's when your energy changes direction. Instead of running toward the person who keeps you confused, you begin to run toward yourself. And this shift rearranges the entire dynamic, because when you stop chasing them, you also stop justifying them inside. A sentence forms, a sentence you used to find frightening. I can't keep giving myself to places that can't hold me. Simple words. But the moment they echo through your mind, your sense of dignity stands back up on its feet. And from there something deeper happens. Silence no longer scares you, it becomes a boundary, a shelter, the mature choice you should have made long before you start to understand that their behavior never determined your worth. What defines your worth is your choice not to stay where reciprocity doesn't exist, and this choice, delicate yet enormous, marks the beginning of your personal freedom. Patterns become visible, the endless waits, the half answers, on and off attention, the promises that dissolved before the day was over. It was all a loop, draining you quietly, a cycle you mistook for love. Your internal turning point comes when you finally admit that you can't keep betraying your peace just to remain in spaces that starve you. That moment is an act of love directed inward, and nobody else can choose that for you. As this truth expands inside you, something powerful shifts. You're done being chosen halfway. If someone wants you, they have to want all of you, or they can want none of you. This is where your story pivots, not when they notice your value, but when you stop placing your value in hands that can't carry it. The real decision is this: you're not closing the door on others, you're finally opening the door for yourself. The choice begins internally, but the execution is what transforms everything. It's not a dramatic gesture, not a declaration. It's a quiet internal realignment that begins to show itself in your daily behavior. The first shift is simple. You stop running. You stop responding immediately. You stop decoding every sign. You stop building meaning where there is only emptiness. Your calm becomes your new language. Then comes the second shift. You reclaim your time. Time you used to offer without thinking becomes something sacred, not because you wanted to punish them, but because you finally understand how much it was costing you. You start choosing where your energy goes, and more importantly, where it no longer goes. You remove the noise, the emotional clutter, the things that consume you. Your attention stops being an open door. It becomes a threshold with weight and intention, and with these quiet adjustments, the entire dynamic flips. Because the ego that took you for granted feeds on reactions, and when you stop reacting, their little kingdom begins to shake. Then comes the third shift, the hardest one. You stop asking. No more confirmation, no more promises, no more late explanations. You learn that some answers arrive only when you stop chasing them, and something invisible begins to happen. Everything that used to unsettle you now slides away without leaving a mark, not because it hurts less, but because you've changed the way you stand in your own story. You talk less and observe more. You notice patterns. You see the subtle manipulation. You see the coldness dressed up as maturity, and most of all, you realize you no longer want to take part in that script. The real execution isn't blocking someone. It's blocking the access they used to have to your mind. It's ending the narrative that drained you. It's refusing to offer yourself as the solution to a problem that was never yours. You begin choosing new silence, not the kind that beg for attention, but the kind that guard your peace, not the kind that wait for a return, but the kind that close the cycle inside you. And whenever they try to revive the old, Gammoth vague messages, the confusing signals, the words that promise but never deliver. You simply don't step in anymore. You smile, you breathe, you let it pass because now you understand your reactions were there, adrenaline, your confusion was there, shelter, your availability was there, power. Take away those three things and the relationship collapse into the emptiness it was built on. Then comes the fourth shift. Almost effortlessly you stop idealizing, you stop rebuilding the best version of them from scraps. You stop creating softer versions of someone who consistently showed you distancing. When idealization crumbles, reality shows up clear, mature, unromantic, a reality that frees you from the loop of hope and disappointment. The fifth shift is the quietest. You choose yourself day after day in small actions that once seemed insignificant, but now completely recalibrate your emotional world. You discover that without that person, do you breathe easier? That silence isn't emptiness, but space. That calm isn't waiting, but healing. That your life was never small, it was simply suffocating. And the practical part of this whole transformation always lands in the same place. You stop chasing the person who never knew how to stay, and they suddenly, stripped of the power your attention used to give them, begin to feel strangely lost. Your new calm is impossible to ignore. The moment you stop running, the absence of your footsteps leaves an echo that echo unnerves them. That's where the tests begin. The first test shows up disguised as selective nostalgia, vague message, a harmless sentence that doesn't actually say anything yet slips into your mind like a key to a door you already closed. They call it reaching out. You should call it faith. And comes the gentler trap, the soft return, a sweetness that wasn't there when you needed it, an unexpected kindness, a tone dipped in warmth that isn't affection. It's strategy, it's fear dressed as tenderness, fear of losing the influence they once had over you. And as they lean in, your mind wavers because the distance was starting to heal you, but the heart remembers the good moments as if they were the entire story. Your mind knows better, your heart wants another chance, and you're caught in the tension between the 12. Strongest temptation is always the same. What if this time is different? A dangerous question, a whisper inviting you to ignore everything you've learned, a promise that exists only inside your imagination. Then arrives the silence reversal test. They disappear to see if you'll run after them again. You feel the pressure. You feel that old instinct to prove, to explain, to rescue something that was never meant to be saved. But when you resist, when you let silence work in your favor, something unexpected happens. Their ego loses its grip on the game. And that's when the uneasiness begins. Suddenly their signals become contradictory. Warm one day, cold the next, present for an hour, distant the following one. It's not random, it's a desperate attempt to see whether they still have access to you. Your temptation, though, is more subtle, believing that attention equals change. But you must remember, someone who truly wants you doesn't test you, isn't measure you, doesn't use you as fuel for their sense of importance. The most painful test, a person they offer you half love, emotional crumbs, occasional presence, fragile promises that look sturdy only when you're tired, and inside you the hardest fight begins. Settle or honor yourself here. Your ego gets loud, it wants to be chosen, it wants to feel victorious, it wants a different ending, but your soul wants peace. And only one of the two will save you. The final temptation comes when they prayed everything you could have had: happy photos, perfectly curated stories, calculated hints of a life that looks full. It isn't happiness, it's provocation, a stage performance meant to prick a pride that no longer plays their game. And when you resist all of it, nostalgia, the sweet return, the manipulative silence, that's when the cycle cracks, because they finally understand you're no longer catchable. These tests don't end by accident. The end when they realize they can't predict you anymore, that your silence isn't longing, it's intention, that your distance isn't injury, but it's healing, and their loss of control becomes your doorway to freedom. Peace doesn't arrive all at once, it comes in layers. It unfolds through quiet daily epiphanies, like sunlight slipping through a window you were once afraid to open. That's when your real stability begins. The first layer forms when you notice their opinion doesn't move you anymore, doesn't sting, doesn't define you. Their absence isn't an emptiness you need to fill, it becomes silence that finally matches your breathing. Then comes an even more powerful realization. You don't want to prove anything to anyone anymore. You don't want to persuade, you don't want to force someone to understand you. Your energy is no longer available to those who can't recognize it. As this freedom grows, you begin to notice something else you always overlooked: self-respect, respect for your time, for your boundaries, for your feelings. It's not a behavior, it's an internal posture. that no longer bends the anchoring of this new reality happens when you stop reliving the past win. You no longer replay endless conversations in your head. When you stop reconstructing scenes 100 times trying to carve out a different ending. You stop searching for a why and begin looking for a from here. Onward. As this mindset strengthens, even your memories change shape. Moments that once pulled you down now make you smile softly, not out of longing but out of understanding. That's what maturity looks like when it finally settles into your life. Then comes the most delicate moment of a lie. You stop romanticizing what happened. You stop demonizing it too. You see it for what it was, not a love story, not a tragedy, not a permanent scar, just a chapter of your life. You can now close without shaking when the wound finally seals. The need for answers fade aside. You don't want explanations anymore. You don't want late apologies. You don't want dramatic closure. The truth you've built inside yourself is enough. And then something shifts in the way you see yourself. You stop judging the version of you who once begged for attention. You thank them, because without that vulnerability you wouldn't have the strength you now carry. A strength that no longer trembles at the idea of being alien. Inner consolidation is realizing you're no longer afraid of silence. Silence isn't punishment. It's sacred ground, a quiet room where you can finally hear your own voice without interference, without conflict, without that old battle between what you felt and what you allowed yourself to admit. And as this calm deepens, the final test arrives. You no longer want them back, not out of bitterness, but because you don't need them anymore. Sometimes freedom is born the moment you stop calling important something that was only familiar. The version of you emerging now is sharper, more grounded, more awake. You no longer reach for what once felt indispensable. You've discovered that your presence is worth far more than any sucesso. You begin choosing differently, quietly, without ceremony. You choose people who listen without testing you, connections that don't demand you sacrifice your peace, conversations that don't drain you. Souls you don't have to decipher. Internal consolidation is exactly this: returning to yourself, reclaiming your center, feeling your worth stabilized, no longer swayed by someone else's attention. You are no longer shaky ground. You are your own anchor. When the mind stops fighting, the heart changes direction. It stops following what dazzles and starts following what nourishes. It stops seeking what attracts and chooses what sustains. This is the quiet selection of emotionally mature hearts. And as you settle inside, the outside world changes shape to the very words that once stung now slide off you without leaving marks. Dynamics that once trapped you now look small, almost absurd. That's the perspective that healing gives you. At this stage, something irreversible happens. Your calm is no longer a phase. It becomes territory, a place you can return to, a place you built, not a gift someone granted you. And when calm becomes home, you stop accepting doors that open only when it's convenient for someone else. You stop tolerating love that flickers. You stop entertaining silence that manipulates. Your silence now is worth more than their presence. Internal consolidation always ends in the same way, with longer looking back, because you finally have something far more important ahead of you. Yourself whole and undivided. Just when you think they've understood, they haven't. Their mind doesn't accept reality immediately. First it resists, then it twists it, then it fights it. Only at the end does it surrender. And inside that struggle did the real collapse begins. They start rereading your old message words they once ignored now look priceless. Gestures they dismissed now hurt. Efforts they minimized now feel irreplaceable. It's emotional memory arriving too late. And while they rummage through the past, you close the chapter. It's not that you feel nothing. It's that you finally feel yourself clearly, solidly, and that new self-awareness terrifies someone who was used to being the center of your storms. Next consequence is internal dissonance. They see your evolution. They notice you're lighter. They notice the brightness in your eyes. And it confuses them, because in their private fantasy you were never supposed to shine. Without them, this is where the true torment begins. They realize they weren't the love of your life. They were the obstacle to your growth. And no ego survives that realization. Unto Chedthire mind then activates the last line of defense: devaluation. They label you cold, selfish, indifferent, because it's true, but because they need a villain to avoid facing their own emptiness. Devaluation is their desperate attempt to reclaim power, but it doesn't last, because the more they try to shrink you, the more they see how small they were in the face of your depth. And exactly here, the most painful awareness is born. They weren't fleeing from you. They were fleeing from the version of themselves that your presence forced them to see. A version they can no longer ignore. Then comes the emotional recoil, a return. That isn't spoken, but felt. They watch your posts, track your online pattern, search for clues, signs, crumbs of your life. You don't see it, but their mind is consumed by your silence, and the steadier you become, the more they begin to unravel, because they start sensing an unsettling truth. You didn't become strong in spite of them. You became strong precisely because they're no longer part of your life. The sixth consequence is the realization of the point of no return. It doesn't appear. When they notice your go night appears, when they realize that even if they came back, they wouldn't find the same person waiting for them. That is the wound the ego cannot stitch together. The ego can handle rejection, it can handle distance, it can even tolerate endings, but it cannot endure losing its influence. So their mind begins asking questions they never imagined would cross their thoughts. Was it my fault? Why did I destroy something that mattered? Didn't I recognize their worth when it was right in front of me? Why doesn't this person look at me the same way anymore? These questions hurt. They hurt because there's no external answer to soothe them. They hurt because the truth is a mirror and they've never learned how to look inward. The seventh consequence is surrender. Not spoken, not admitted, not expressed through words, but visible in their energy, because someone who once used you as their anchor now has to drown Alani, and the final blow comes when they grasp a simple, brutal, irreversible truth. You were the only thing in their entire story. That wasn't a game, and that's exactly what they ruin. It. This is where the last echo forms. That quiet remorse that doesn't fatteth it, not in the throat, that arrives late. That cold razor-like clarity whispering, "Ye lost the one person I should have never lost." And you don't feel revenge, you don't feel triumph, you don't feel superiority. You feel peace, and peace is the kind of power no one can fake. Your calm becomes their reckoning. Your silence becomes their mirror. Your healing becomes their collapse. And in the end, everything condenses into a sentence they will never dare to say out loud, but one that will follow them quietly for years. I was wrong about you. And you finally have no reason to look back. The game is over, the door is closed, and your story begins again. And this is where your story lands, not in the ruins, not in the ache, but in the rise, because the truth is simple and powerful and often arrives quietly. Their rejection was never the end, it was the ignition. Look at who you are now. Look at the steadiness in your posture, the calm in your voice, the clarity in your eyes. You didn't get here because someone valued you, you got here because someone didn't, and you finally learned to value yourself. There is something almost cinematic about this transformation. Music swelling, no dramatic confrontation, no final speech, just a human being who walked through the fire of abandonment and came out on the other side carrying something heavier than pain and far more meaningful: self-mastery. You learn to stop arguing for your worth. You learn to stop negotiating your value. Learn that silence isn't surrender, it's strategy, it's strength, it's sovereignty. And now, without raising your voice, without forcing anything, without chasing what was never your size, stand in a place they can no longer reach. Your silence did what your words never could. Today, it revealed who cared, who didn't, and who only loved the power they had over you. It stripped away illusions, exposed pretenders, and left only one undeniable truth. You grew, they didn't. You evolved, they stayed the same. You chose peace, they chose ego, and ego always collapses in front of a person who has finally learned how to walk alone. Maybe they resurfaced, maybe they regret, maybe they scroll, watch, wonder, replay. Maybe your absence burns more than your presence ever did, but none of that is your concern anymore, because their realization is not your responsibility. Your healing is. And look at you now, you made it through the storm. Without becoming the storm, you walked out of the maze without carrying bitterness. In your hands, you rebuilt yourself in silence and came back stronger than the version of you they once thought was easy to discard. That is your victory, not revenge and not payback, not "I told you so."